Hello and welcome to those who've joined us. Um, it's a fascinating subject, ageism, and we read a lot about it. But here we'd like to focus on our world of insight. And we published a link on, or a quiz on LinkedIn. So for those who filled it in or actually remembered what they put, here are the answers. We asked how many people in the UK will be over 50 by 2030, and the answer is 47%. Well, hey. And what percent of marketing budgets are focused on reaching the 50 plus? And the answer to this one was 5 to 10%. So be interested in how many of you actually got it right or wrong. Going back to the session in hand. So today we brought together clients, agencies and recruiters to share thoughts and experience really on researching the over 50s, the over 65s, and thinking about whether the age of those people who are actually doing the research really matters. And we're going to do this webinar in two parts. So the first part is going to be focusing on those who are researched, and I'll sort of lead it in. And the second part will be on the researcher, which Liz is going to do. And we're lucky in that our clients, Shehnaz and Libby, are considering the nature and the value of this market from two very different standpoints and how best to research it, because it's not, the over 50s are not a homogeneous market, and I think that they'll do their best to stress how that is the case. And we also have the insight industry perspective from Liz and Bri. And Bri might incidentally talk about the bifurcation of this audience, which is also fascinating. And they'll talk to the issue of who we employ to research them. The last thing I will say before we kick off, and before I do a poll, so fingers crossed about the poll, is please post any questions you have as we go along. We will answer them at the end, but not as we go along. So the chat is operating. But first, let's hear from everybody, starting with Liz, who we know from E&I. Liz, would you like to tell us a bit about the Silver Insights generation as well?
Yes, so I'm the founder of Silver Insights Generation. Hopefully some of those that have been really working hard to support me are watching this. We set the group up to improve representation of the Silver Generation. I know we're going to discuss what the Silver Generation is within Insights. And there are three key ways that we want to look at this. So first of all is, how do we research the Silver Generation? Is what we're doing enough? The second is the strategic insight that we provide often ignores the huge opportunity that the Silver Generation offers. And the third is that the number of people Insight employs aged 55 and over is not representative of that group. The age group that represent, or the 55 plus, represent 21% of the working population. We think that with Insight, it's about 3%. So, you know, how do we improve the number of people at that age group working in the area?
So to kick off with, could we all introduce ourselves, apart from me, and one sentence, and finish it by saying, when I think about age representation and insights, I think of, starting with Libby, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, I'm Libby or Elizabeth Webb from Age UK. I'm the head of research here. So we do lots of research ourselves internally, and we also commission some research from lovely people like yourselves. Our work's quite wide-ranging. We sort of tried to focus on older people's financial, healthcare and social needs, but you know, that brings in a lot of things. When I think about age representation in Insights, I think about the really enormous diversity of older people and the importance that insight has in enabling us to understand that in detail.
Shehnaz, please, and thank you.
Okay, so I'm Shehnaz Hansraj, and 2/3 of my research career have actually been agency side, where I led commercial travel and tourism, and I also served as head of digital at Kantar UK. But for the past 7 years, I have been client side, so I've been heading up research and insights at Viking. We are a culturally enriching, destination-focused river, ocean, and expedition cruise line. And our guests range from sort of people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s onwards. But the average age is over 55. And when I think about how Insights sort of represents this age group, I would say there is a big gap. There is a great opportunity, but it's a group it's not being serviced as well as it could or it should, but it does offer a huge commercial opportunity. So I would really like people, whether it's agencies or brands, to sort of bring that more in focus, as it holds. This audience holds, a great commercial opportunity. They're probably the wealthiest in the UK, and yet somehow we focus on younger audiences who are time poor and financially poor and harder to reach and retain. So
Thank you. Bri, would you like to kick off?
Thank you. I'm Brian McIntosh. I'm a senior director at Humanate. And I think going direct to the question you asked there, Luella, about when I think about age when it comes to insights, I think what I keep coming back to is, why as an industry does it feel like we are actively contributing to the invisibility of the plus 65 audience? Because their appearance in research often feels exceptional rather than normal. And I think that's probably one of the big challenges that as an industry we need to get our heads around, and hopefully we could have some of that debate today.
Thank you. And finally, Liz.
Oh, goodness.
You've talked about Silver Insights generation. If you don't, then don't worry.
Yeah, I hadn't realized you were going to ask me about it as well as, but yeah, I guess my key focus is, as a talent person, I'm particularly interested in having more people of that age group within the profession. So that's my main interest. But I am shocked at having learned how little research is done into this age group, so how invisible it is, and also looking at the resulting insight. So, you look at adverts and brands and think, goodness, why are you wasting this opportunity?
Well, first of all, let's try a quiz. So if I can launch it, here we go. So which of these statements about insights in the over 55s best reflects how you feel? Don't know. We really don't serve these age groups. Or we're ready to do good work. So have you all finished? No, not quite. It's still moving. It's still moving. It's still moving. And I promise I will jot the answer down at the end. So I'm just waiting till it gets to so that looks like 17, 72, and 10. Okay. And the reason we did this, I will share the results just so that you can see them, is that we're going to rerun it at the end and see whether any of your opinions have changed. Right, let me stop sharing and shut it down. And let's kick off. So this is meant to be a conversation, and I'm sure it will be. But to start with, what ages are we actually talking about? Because they seem to vary tremendously at where to kick off. I don't mind who starts, but Libby's on my left, so let's start with Libby.
Okay, you mustn't always start with me. I think it depends what we're talking about. We often use 65 because lots of sources of official data use 65 as a sort of cutoff, and lots of agencies do as well. However, that 65 plus group is big and is often not segmented, which is a limitation. You know, state pension age is important to us, so 66 at the moment, creeping up over the years. Sometimes we're thinking about 50 plus. It depends. It really depends. And I think going back to my point about the sort of diversity of this enormous group of people that we're talking about, different people age at different speeds and in different ways for different dimensions of their lives. And so if you think about sort of socioeconomic inequalities, we can see that people who are more advantaged are less old at the same age as people who are less advantaged. So I don't have a clear answer, I'm sorry.
I can see Shehnaz nodding sagely.
Well, it's such an interesting question, isn't it? Because for me, the greatest barrier of why I started to do my own research to look into this ageism bias is because so often with the data research, advertising or marketing information, it often just either stops at 50 or 55 plus and then clumps all the decades along, or it stops at 65 plus. And that doesn't really serve my audience because we are interested in looking at all the sort of 5 and 10 year groups going along. Because as Libby says, they're not homogenous, they behave differently. They have different spending power, they are interested in different things. And I feel like that diversity in itself is underrepresented. So there is that real need to stop sort of generalizing. And that's my plea to agencies. Stop generalizing and at least include that 65 to 74 age bracket. Because as a society and as brands and as agencies, as commentators, we need to be able to understand this group in a lot more detail because people do behave differently. I'm Gen X. Kim Kardashian's Gen X, we don't behave the same. Our needs are not the same. What we enjoy in life is not the same. And that's a really sort of a quite an extreme example, but it's out there. So, yeah.
Do either of you give any guidance on how to split the audience when you're briefing them, or do you expect the agency to give you guidance?
I guess I would usually have different requirements for different cuts by age, depending on the project. Yeah.
I'm always looking for that greater detail. So if an agency tells me they stop at 55 plus, I'm not talking to them. I'm not working with them. And similarly, even with 65 plus, it's too generic. So my plea, even to our own ad agencies, is can you work with the agencies you're working with to give you better information so you can serve us better, so we can serve people in the market better. So it's a full circle and sort of a chicken and egg of how to get this right.
Where do you come into it, Bri?
I agree with the points that have been said at the minute, and I think for me, I think where we've, as an industry, we've probably got a little bit lazy with how we use age, and almost kind of it's taken on a causal element. You often hear that older people think, or older people do, or however we break it, but actually that gives no heed to kind of the different attitudes of those audiences. And for example, if you were to do some research and take age out of the mix, you will see, the commonality may be digital engagement that cross-cuts all age. And I think we just sometimes, it's easy, but we've always kind of thought of audience by age. And I think sometimes it could be easy to use that. And I think, as Shehnaz said, it just obscures the picture because you have a lump of people who, feasibly up to now, 90, from 65 to 90, we just all put in the same space, assuming that we can speak to them in a singular way. It undermines the heterogeneity of that audience. There's as much heterogeneity post 65 as there is pre it, but we don't bring that to the table. And I think when you take all that into consideration, the big challenge there is that it's clearly impacting on data quality, because you're missing nuance and you're missing what genuinely matters, because we're so stuck in this age equals, that determinism that sits around age, which, I think as an industry, we need to just be a bit better.
And we've had a question just winging in about stereotypes, which sort of firms that up. Mm-hmm. Liz, when you talk to clients, do you get this sort of stereotypical categorization?
Yes. So, I mean, obviously my my angle is slightly different. I absolutely agree with everything everyone else has said, but I'm very specifically concerned with the employment of people aged, well, the silver generation. And I actually think that discrimination starts from around 50. It's definitely harder to find work from that age, which, given you've got currently another 16 years of work, is completely ridiculous. It's harder still from 55, and from 60 plus, it's really hard. So, you know, my perspective is slightly different. And yes, I regularly hear from clients things like, oh, well, they'll be earning too much money. When actually, in my view, a lot of people have got to a stage in life where they've paid off the mortgage, their children have left home, they're quite happy to drop on salary expectations, or they wouldn't fit our culture. Or I mean, this is without, that's just the feedback I get straight from the CV. No knowledge of them at all. They're not going to be technically savvy. So there's a lot of really discriminatory comments I get back. It's very, very hard to get somebody an interview if they're 55 plus.
So when we're looking at this audience that is being researched, and okay, not falling into the trap of saying they're homogenous, but what sort of disposable income are we talking about? Because I think it crosses a broad spectrum. Shehnaz has her hand up.
I wanted to sort of pick up on Liz's point and sort of raise something. So when I started to look into ageism bias, what I found was that 50 years ago, so that's 1975, 13% of the population, so that was 7.5 million of people in the UK were 65-year-olds or over 65. But today, this group has almost doubled. So it's representing 1 in 5 of the population. 12.7 million are holding on to a wealth of 2.6 trillion pounds. So that's a big stat. The second one I wanted to raise was 50 years ago, the average life expectancy was 72 years old. So you probably had about 7 years after you retired to live life and enjoy it. But now that average age expectancy, and its average, is 82 years. So you've got at least 20 years after you retire to really live life to its fullest. And these days, people are healthier, wealthier. They want the experiences. And so how do we sort of change our mindset as a society, but also as an industry? And it is not just about researching, you know, people who are over 55 or over 65 and over 75 to understand them, but equally, yes, including them in employment, because ultimately, when you look into marketing teams, advertising teams, research teams, we're a lot younger than the audience we're marketing to, and we're not marketing to ourselves. So how do we change that mindset? And part of that is how we're researching that audience, so we effectively don't impose our thought processes, but what people are actually genuinely feeding, thinking, breathing, living, so they don't feel so invisible and so stereotyped and so unheard.
And Shehnaz, inspired by your research, I too looked at, so between 1975 and today, so 50 years, I looked at the percentage increase in the working population. It's 143%. And that's partly because retirement age has gone up, and partly because the number of people living to those sorts of ages has increased. But 143%.
That's incredible. I mean, their spending power, for example, has increased by 75% in 20 years. 75%. That completely caught me off guard, even though, you know, I work with an older age group, and I obviously work with a brand that has that foresight, but that's quite and in equivalent, people under 50, their spending power in the same 20 years has gone down by 16%. So those are really powerful stats that really focus and engage the mind to think we need to be doing something differently here.
But have the poor also got poorer? Does anyone reckon?
So pensioner poverty is lower than it was 20 years ago. it was around 25%, and now it's more like 16%, I think. So there's almost 2 million pensioners in poverty. So I think that goes back to my original point about the diversity. Like Shehnaz's client group is obviously really key and important. There's also people who are never going on a cruise and, you know, can't even dream of it. And that's why we need this rich understanding of this enormous group of people, because, you know, there's people who I need to be thinking about, and there's people who Shehnaz needs to be thinking about, and they are different people in many ways. I was thinking when we were talking about you know, age in insight and stereotypes, and I think one of the things that I've noticed coming through in the last few years is an increasing discussion about generation, and I think that can often have tied stereotypes to it. You know, when we talk about baby boomers, there's an image in people's minds, and it probably is the older person who's going on a cruise. And I just think we can, if we merely move away from talking about 65 plus to talk about baby boomers instead, then that doesn't do us any service either.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to the second part of our discussion today, which we've talked about the audience. What about the research element? Liz, would you like to take charge of this bit? Just kick it off.
Yes. So, well, so I'm just going to ask the entire panel, how do we do well and badly at researching this age group? So, Bree, I know that I mean, it's not just about sampling people by age, is it?
Yep.
It's got to be more than that.
Absolutely, and I think that's where this big gap of nuances, going back to just the conversation we were having there, you know, about are older people rich or are they poor? I mean, would we say the same to those under 65? So would we say, well, they're either rich or poor? Where is the everything in between?
Exactly.
And I think that's the challenge of it, that we're just one dimensional with that audience. And you know, if you take some of the ways in which we treat that audience from a research perspective, or those audiences, we would never have an age category that was 10 years old to 40 years old. You'd get laughed out the building if you tried that. But 65 plus, let's go for it. You know, and it's unquestioned. And I think part of that's down to the real kind of how deeply embedded perceptions of age are in culture. You know, if you happen to be off work during the week and you watch TV, you'd be mistaken for thinking if you're old, you either live in a sepia-tinged world where it's lovely and great, and you know, you're sipping champagne in the garden while you're chopping down your dahlias, or you're freezing to death in a council house. That's the only images you tend to see, and it's extreme ends, but we never see the real. We see the stereotype, and I think that's part of the problem, because that seeps into thinking about age, and that's when often becomes a lot of justifications, maybe not for including those 65 plus audiences, because the lens that comes to them first and foremost is it's based on stereotype. I still remember really early on in my career, doing a screener, and I queried about the 65 plus age, and it's like, oh, but they might not be able to get down the stairs at a viewing facility. You know, and it was just kind of, I'm sure it was good intentioned, but it was based on a stereotype of fragility and, you know, immobility, when that had no basis in reality. And I think that's where we've got lazy. We're not challenging some of those things that feel so embedded as a truth. And I think that's where, if we're going to make a change here, we need to start really fronting up to, is how I think about this audience true, or is it just a deeply embedded thing that I've always thought, but actually couldn't evidence if I tried?
I think another point I want to pick up on that, Brie, is when I get asked often, are the over 65 online? And this is the most tedious question ever, because for over 15 years now, 9 in 10 people in the UK are online, and how they might be online might vary. So it's about brands and agencies recognizing and understanding that. But you'd have to do the research to be aware of actually how they behave versus making those perceptions, or, you know, how they use a mobile device, again, varies. You know, they multi-screen. So they might be watching your ad on TV, but they're also on their tablet, immediately tapping onto the website and doing something about it. So that actionability of call to action from any kind of media as well really understanding that so you get more out of your media spend, for example. So, I mean, it's limitless what we could be doing better and more of.
I think as well, with it, none of us on this call today are here to engage in moral entrepreneurship around age. We've all done research with this audience and we've got the receipts. We know that actually when you look closely and you get up close and personal, you see the realities of the audience and also the opportunities that are there. And you've got to think, in this economy in particular, where is the logic of just ignoring, as Shehnaz has already pointed out, an audience that does have a significant amount of disposable income? Yet we're quite happy as marketeers to focus on the next shiny thing. We're already looking at alphas that I think are still in nappies. They don't have any money, but because of the shiny thing, and maybe that's where we need to take a step back as an industry and say, it's not always about chasing the shiny, it's about chasing the real. And that's maybe where we can do better.
But Bree, where do we start with that? So I hear that we need to research it better, but more specifically, what do you think? I mean, just for example, SMR has improved its code. It now asks people to break age bands down by, I think it's 5 years all the way up to something like 95. But is that alone enough? What more can we do? Do we need to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's a collective effort involved, because you can imagine a project where you're maybe asked to, the spec is I want to speak to 70-year-olds. You might go out to a panel company and they say, oh, we don't have those people on there. It's their responsibility to change that. And then it's our responsibility as researchers to make sure we include them. And it's, everyone's got a role to play. It's not going to be one solution. And yeah, that might be tough, and yeah, it might be a bit difficult, but that's what's required. This isn't an easy fix, and if these people are harder to find to get into research, then that's the problem to solve, not the reason to disengage. But it will take every kind of part of that funnel, from finding to researching to talking about to acting to innovating for. Every one of us has a role to play to make sure that we're vigilant to that and not just kind of let kind of things go as they've always been, because it's easier to do so.
Elizabeth or Libby, I haven't asked you. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I know I said we wouldn't look at the chats, but I think there is a very relevant one from Elaine Francis, who said, we also need to look at how, not just why, we exclude. And I think if we're going to get better, I just wonder whether anyone has any hints on how.
I think before we get to the how, I just wanted to raise as well, they're not harder to find. So when I worked with this audience in my agency days, what really I found remarkable, and that was a learning phase for me, was they're much easier to find. They're more engaged because they're not being spoken to. So the fact that you take the time and include them in research, they are far more responsive. They often also don't require incentivization in the same traditional ways. It's not monetary, it's experiential, because that's what they value more. So it's really taking the time to work out how to engage with this audience and how to draw them out and how to keep them close, because what you learn from them, even for your younger audiences, is invaluable.
I agree, Shehnaz, and I think on that, let me just qualify what I was saying. Often that, I agree, I've done research with this audience and they are absolutely brilliant. Honestly, from an engagement level, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. But what I was talking about more is when we put requests out to, say, a panel company, if you want to do a survey with that, the kind of default is, well, that those people are harder to reach. And it's like, well, okay, but so how are you going to reach them, rather than just taking that as a full stop? And I think it's those little frictions, micro frictions, if you want, that we need to be challenged on a daily basis, rather than saying, sorry, no. It's like, that's hard, but how?
Libby.
I just, in terms of how to reach people, I guess sort of drawing back to what Shehnaz was saying about being online, it's absolutely true that most older people are online. The ways in which they're online might be different, like Shehnaz said, but there are also quite a substantial proportion who aren't online. And I think that, since the pandemic, there's been a move away from offline options when it comes to research. And I think if you really want to reach a representative sample of people aged 65 plus, you do need to have an offline option as well, because there's certain groups of that older population who are much more likely to not be online. So older women, older people who live alone, older minority ethnicity people, older people, older, more socially disadvantaged people. So yeah, if you really want to, and I think that, I guess, in a sort of NatRep samples situation, I think often what we have is like 65 plus is just treated as a sort of clump, and there isn't that more detail in terms of who is nationally representative within 65 plus. So you end up with a lot of younger, older people who are more online, and that's not everybody.
Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective. I think we need to move on to the next point, which is if we employed more people aged 50 and 55 within Insight, both client side, agency, comms agencies. I mean, to be honest, from the outside, they all look pretty ageist when it comes to who they employ. Do you think that would help? So shall I start with, well, Libby, you're there. Let's start with you.
I think that diversity of all sorts in terms of researchers is really important, and also lacking in many ways. You know, we're often middle-class white women of a certain you know, I'm squarely in that box myself, so I can't critique, but yeah, I think we need more diversity in researchers in all sorts of ways, including age. And I think, you know, when you start to think about it, you realize it feels like there's a glass ceiling at about 35. But I think there's ageism in all sorts of industries, and I'm trying to think if I think research is a standout, or I think there's definitely a whole society problem. So maybe there are learnings for the research sector from other sectors who've made some good progress.
Where does empathy come?
Yeah, interestingly, the areas that have made good progress are areas where people feel they can give back. So a huge proportion of the UK care workers, and so not bringing in people from overseas, but UK care workers are aged over 60. And that's because actually a lot of people in the older age group are no longer motivated by money and getting to the top. What they want to do is give back. So another area apparently where there are a lot of older people, well, lollipop people, for example, often older. Apparently school caretakers are often older, but they're areas where people feel that actually what motivates them is doing something for society rather than earning lots of money.
And that's the flip side of this conversation is you hear of industries where their employees are an average older age, and they're all stressing about how, oh no, like 10% of our workforce is going to retire in the next 5 years, and then that becomes the opposite end of the problem. Maybe everybody needs to think differently.
I think
it's interesting. Sorry. I was going to say, with the abolishment of the default pension age, over a decade ago now, you know, currently it's about 10%. In our audience, Viking, it's about 15% of over 65s actually choosing to still work. And sometimes they're quite high-flying careers, whether it's full-time or part-time, and they're contributing over £60 billion to the UK economy. But I feel like, you know, when we do research with this age group, most of them feel more than 20 years younger than the actual figure itself. And so I think it's really harnessing that. It's not how you look, it's how you feel. So coming back to the empathy, but also the ability. And I feel like we're missing such an opportunity here of, you know, not engaging, not having people who are over 50, over 55, over 65, still working in various different commercial opportunities. As far as I can see, I mean, our role model, our MD, she is within this group. So that's great to sort of be led by example. But I want to see more of those faces, because I feel like there's still so much to learn from these people. And, you know, what can we be doing more to employ people who are considered older, whatever that means these days.
I think I'll chip in and go back to what Liz was saying, and then to follow up what you're saying there, Shehnaz. So, Liz, I think the the one thing I wouldn't say is you don't need to be older to research older, because I think you start getting into standpointism and the idea that you can only understand people that you are yourself. And I think it comes down to good research, whatever age you are. But I think, you know, perhaps it speaks to some of the skill sets and kind of younger researchers, is that from my experience, when you're researching these older groups, it's less about asking and more about listening. You know, and I think it's very easy to ask questions, but where you get the value from older audiences, simply because of experience and that kind of tapestry of life that they've got. You know, it's when we run an online community, and to date I've seen nothing as engaged as that, and it was brilliant. But we literally just had to press play and listen. That, you know, the groups had stories to tell, they had points of view, you know, and actually maybe that's where it's less about, do we need to have old to research old, and actually do we need to maybe stay committed to some of those core principles when we do qual research in particular, where, you know, it's not just conveyor belt research, but it's really about those fundamentals that will help us genuinely understand different groups in kind of society, including orders that we research.
And I agree. I think that the 55 plus certainly have a lot of knowledge and wisdom that is very useful, actually, particularly in the day now we've got more and more AI. We need people to think outside the box and challenge some of the preconceived ideas. I think it's easier to do that with that sort of wisdom that comes with age. But I also think it's, going back to Elizabeth's point, you know, diversity, it's very healthy. And I do think, well, the research shows that older people are more resilient. You know, they've seen things before, and particularly when you're going through a lot of change, which the profession is now, actually some of that sort of calm resilience, we've been there, we've seen technological change before, is a very useful skill to add to the diversity of thinking within a company.
Just throw that back to you though. I'm not expecting you to have an answer, don't worry, but where in the industry are the career pathways for 50 plus people that don't necessarily want to climb the greasy pole? You know, where do we have them as an industry? Do we have those pathways that if you wanted to be a researcher, but not necessarily get into directors and things like that? I can't think of anyone I know in the industry that is doing that.
But then I think, to Elizabeth's point, this is a society problem. It's not just insight, that actually overall in work, we're expecting everybody, you know, we do reviews based on, you know, where are you going to be in 5 years' time? And people are expected to be constantly moving forward. That isn't for everybody. You know, actually, it's not for everybody that's younger than 55, but it's much more likely to be the case for people that are 55 plus. They've got other priorities. That's why they want to go into the caring profession. That's why they want to give back.
Or they're let go.
Yeah.
It's racing on. I'd like to leave it with two things. One thing really, from both Shehnaz and Libby. If you had to give two statements as to what the research industry could do better, what would you like to see? And then I think we'll move on to some questions if there are any. So starting with Shehnaz, I think. Two things.
Gosh, I may have already said these out loud before. One is to not clump that age group. I don't want to see advertising sort of stats coming back stopping at 55 plus or even 65 plus. I want to see that next age bracket as a starting point. So 65 to 74, please start including that in all your research. It's not difficult. It's such an easy fix. And the other one is for anybody that says, you know, it's hard to target this group. It's a bit of ethnography. It's like fish where fish are. Watch these people. As a brand, you sort of invite everyone that works in any role within the brand to spend some time with our guests to see what they do, how they engage, how they speak, what matters to them. And so using a little bit of that information as to how you target people, how you engage with them. So trust, for example, is very important. So how do you demonstrate that trust? when you try and engage with this age group is hugely important, trust and respect. So I think I would leave it at those 2 points for now. Libby.
I think I've only got one point, which I feel like is the same point I've been making throughout. I think the key thing is to do what's needed to reach the full diversity of older people, and that means, you know, making sure that your nationally representative sample is truly nationally representative. It means having sample sizes that allow for intersectional analysis, because not all old people are the same age, they're not all the same ethnicity, they don't all have a disability or not, you know, there's an awful lot going on. So yes, more please from everybody. And
I want to see
ideally,
longitudinal data.
Yes, ideally, since I'm a client, I'd like it cheaper and quicker as well, if you don't mind.
Luella, there's some really good and interesting points in the chat. Is there a way of capturing those at all?
Yes,
Brilliant.
there is.
Yeah.
Some of them we can sort of look at and talk about in a minute. They'll all be in there recorded, but not on the recording, sadly.
Okay.
But I can send them to you if you want to comment on them, and we can send them to the people who actually commented.
Okay.
In the short term, let's answer at least one of the questions, and then maybe go around some of the others. So we've got one from Payush Manakar, who says, do you think there's a noticeable divide in how research studies approach older age groups when it comes to products and services? It seems that social research tends to focus more on older populations, while marketing research largely targets younger demographics. And this gives an impression of a clear distinction between studies driven by social impact versus those driven by profitability. Any comments on that one?
Well, my comment would be, if they're looking for profitability, why are they not going for the audience that has the money, which is the silver generation? So I'm not able to comment on the different sorts of research because I'm not a researcher, but it does seem mad to me that that marketing research is focusing on the younger audience if what it is looking for is to make money.
I think just building on that as well, it touches upon something I said earlier, but it's the cult of magpieism. You know, it's this kind of rush to get the shiny. You know, and I think that's you know, it's no one business, but there's this cultural need to find the next new thing, uncover the next new thing. And as you've said there, Liz, by doing so, you're missing the opportunity that's within plain sight, because it's always about chasing what's new. It's Gen X, it's Gen Z, it's alphas. Hold on. Look at what's in front of you. But you know, that's I think it's a cultural thing that sits above any particular business or agency. I just think it's just the way things are, and that's where it's going to be really difficult, because let's be clear, if you know, old age does not have a reputation of being cool research, and sometimes that's just how things play out, and that's where the change needs to come in my view.
We've got another thing on chat which says older people from ethnic backgrounds are even more excluded. Language comprehension are often used as excuses to not include. Do you come across that a lot?
I mean, absolutely, it's obvious. So older minority ethnicity people are more likely to not have English as their first language than younger people from minority ethnicities. And obviously reaching people in different languages is costly, time consuming, resource intensive. So and the additional challenge of although the older population is increasingly diverse in terms of ethnicity, it is less so than the younger population. So there's an argument, you know, the argument is made that it's very difficult to find these people. They're hiding. Not really.
Got another one which says, speaking of the how we can address this target, is it not a stereotypical approach? I would say address them exactly as others, which is a fair point. Okay, what else do we have?
I wanted to pick up Sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on the point that was made in the comments, and I do feel like even when I was doing my research on research, that commercial organizations have a lot to learn from social organizations, because social organizations have to represent everybody, whereas commercial organizations choose to represent the age group that they choose to represent, which is a bit of a failing for themselves in a commercial aspect. Because if I look back to where I work, we're only going to be we're 28 years old, and we've built 100 ships based on targeting this audience around the world. So there's obviously an opportunity there, and there's an opportunity, I feel, for everybody, and it's just taking the time to really think. And it's not just about travel or cruising, it's about understanding that middle bit that, sort of Bri mentioned, because that helps us grow as a community, as a society, as a country, as the world. So there's just so much that is being overlooked, that really needs to be tapped into. But it's not sexy, it's not cool. How do we make it sexy and cool? Maybe that's something we need to think about, which is why I thought, let's take the commercial approach versus just focus on empathy and feelings, because feelings doesn't put breakfast on the table. But there's just so much that is to be said there.
Libby, you had your hand up, I think.
Just wondering about, I mean, obviously my world isn't market research, mine is more social research. I wonder whether ageist stereotypes around older people being stuck in their ways and not being flexible also feed into idea it's not worth marketing to older people because they buy what they buy and they're not going to change. So how am I going to get them to be persuaded that my product is the best product? I think ageist stereotypes pervade this conversation from all directions, don't they?
I think when you look at the research, that what we find about that exact thing when we speak to older people, though, is they are very conscious that brands are ignoring them. They're not just happily fading into the background, because they're not seen as commercially viable. They're very aware, that they're not kind of the in crowd. And when you measure that up with that audience, as an audience with that higher disposable income, when we talk about them in that respect, it just seems foolhardy. It's almost like there's a weird screen that's come up that just obscures this audience, that makes brands maybe turn away from them, except a few perhaps. But it goes back to that point. Once you speak to this audience, once you listen to this audience, that's when, yes, you see challenges with how you can work with this audience, but the opportunities, they're, without using a cliche, the low-hanging fruit is there, but there just seems to be an aversion, whether that's because belief in stereotypes or perceptions of difficulty, that's stopping that from cutting through. And I think that's where we've all got a responsibility to challenge, and not just kind of keep going because we've always done it that way. I think it's always just be critical of your own thinking towards who you're including when it comes to research, and check your biases.
Lovely bit on chat at the moment, which says, having interviewed many of them, I was struck and envious by their free spirit, their cut to the chase state of mind, their laughs even when it's tough. The job is done, the nest is finally empty, having to work is over, oppressive even if you love it. The obsession with the perfect body fades away, and here's the wonder, they no longer have anything to prove to anyone. They know their limits, they yes, no, they can finally free themselves from the social exhortation to always perform. The job is done, but they are not done. Okay, sorry, Liz.
Well, I would agree with all of that. And I was just going to say, as somebody who's 64, so definitely falls into the silver generation, I was brought up in the 60s. Obviously, that was my sort of formative years, which was a very free-spirited generation. And I'm definitely not done in terms of, the brands that I choose or the way of life that I was just completely mad. It's not true. I'm very open to new ideas, new brands, new thinking.
And I think that's something people really often forget, that, if we're talking about older people being 60 plus, say, then it includes people who were raised in the 60s, like you say. There's an idea that everybody wants to listen to Vera Lynn and talk about the war. And, that isn't any longer, times have moved on.
I think on that, Libby, one of the quotes that stays with me from the research that I've done with this audience, and it's quite direct and it's bloody good, let's be honest. They said, you all think that we listened to Frank Sinatra, but actually we gave you Pink Floyd. And that's the thing I always come back to when I think about these audiences, because I think in the space of 10 words, nothing sums it up better than that, we are stuck in the Frank Sinatra lens of older people, and they're like, we were out living our best lives, bringing, disrupting, and really changing the world. And that's where those people are still. That's the age that they feel inside. But that's the one thing I keep coming back to this audience. So that I don't think it could crystallize any clearer than that. And from the words of those that, once you listen to them, that's what you hear. So
and you really see that freeing spirit as well when you sort of see them travel too. So even sort of looking at the older age groups, or sort of over 75, they're more adventurous. They want more destination immersion to even the group that's 10 years younger. They want to see and experience new things. So for us to assume that they just, it's pipe and slippers club, I'm sorry, but we're sadly mistaken, because while we're having an early night, they're out partying or enjoying life. And that is the reality of it. So,
and those perceptions, Shehnaz, that's an us problem. That's not a them problem. And
100%.
that's where the change
100%.
starts, is let's just check what we think about this older audience, because there's a really good chance it's not that accurate.
It's probably wrong, or we're just sort of assuming it on the base of one anecdote versus actually watching them and see how they interact with your products, with your services, and how they find that quick fix and a way to overcome issues and problems, and problem solving, for example. It's sometimes next level, I have found. So it's keeping that open mind as well, because you might be genuinely surprised.
I'm determined to run that poll again, but just before we do, there's a lovely one which says, totally agree, change needs to come from all areas of research, changing clients, researchers, PMs, recruiters' thoughts to this. Having completed a large project online of over 60s, of which over 60% were 75 plus, it was about allowing slightly longer lead time to allow contacting different groups, etc., and allowing for different ability levels, allowing for someone to help them if needed to complete, etc. It went so well, and as Bry said on one of his projects, the depth of knowledge and insight is amazing when you give them the time. So let me do that poll one more time if I can find it. No, I'm just going to close. Here we go. Polls and quizzes. Right. Back. I'm going to launch this one. Okay. Fill in, please, people. And let's see whether there's any change. Oh, 100%. Bloody hell. No, gone down to 75%. Right, let me just compare. So that one's gone up to 19. That one's gone up to 75. And that one's gone up to 66. Down to 6. So a small change. So the first one, it's gone from 17% to 19%. So you're patting yourselves on the back. The second one is we really don't serve these age groups, has gone up from 72 to 75. And the third one, in terms of don't knows, it's got better. We've gone down from 10% to 6%. So improvement. Okay, it's now about 5 minutes to. Should we go for one more chat and have a look at what's there? And then I will say thank you very much. I feel the marketing strategies have become old for not considering these age groups. We need innovation here, says Piyush. And Alex says, even in research for digital products, we tend to screen by behaviour more than by age across sectors. Often there's more deviation within demographics than across them. Passions, habits and personalities don't stick within generational groupings once you look. Any comments on those two?
I think for the point Alex made, I would just say absolutely. Again, nailed it. It's that, you know, age is a number on a page. It's not behavior. And that, you know, if you're genuinely interested in understanding humans, people, we need to look at it through the lens of, you know, what matters to them, rather than kind of sticking to old school, you know, gender, age, postcodes, social grades. You know, bigger questions to be asked around those as, you know, population distinguishers anyway, but absolutely focus on behaviours and you'll start to see the diversity.
But presumably, as well as looking at behaviours, you need to ensure that you're actually researching a significant or the right representative proportion of older people. So I get it that, but if you're just looking at behaviours and you're not actually including the behaviours of older people in the survey, it's pointless. You've got to make
Agreed.
sure they're
Yeah.
represented.
We don't know what we don't know, and I think that's the greater problem within the industry, which is what we need to, and you know, sort of overcome and create some kind of hub where we do build, I mean, on this understanding. Because just reading through the comments, there's some fantastic points that have been made. I wish I could have spoken to all of you before I did my conference session, just to get your point of view on this as well, because there is so much to be said and thought about, and it's how do we, yeah, create that, well, we don't know until we start to actually speak to these people as human beings rather than age on a page.
I think, Liz, again, to the point you made there, I think, yes, those kind of characteristics, age and the like, they're good, and yeah, they might be influential. Where we need to be better is seeing them as deterministic, because age is not a determinant of behaviour. It may influence behaviour, but it's absolutely not a causal factor, and that's where we, again, fall down. But it's because age is so omnipresent in everything, and there's so much assumptions built into it. And that's where, once again, without banging the same drum, it's us that need to be better when we're measuring this than anything else, I think.
We will be sharing some learnings on LinkedIn, so do not fear too much, and posting a recording of this session online. But I just wonder, from the audience's point of view, are there any myths that you feel this conversation has busted for you as a matter of interest? And if you haven't, we will say goodbye nicely. I can't see any coming up. I know it's made me rethink a lot of things, actually, and I hope we've come up with some positives in terms of how we can change as an industry to service you better as well. But no, nobody's coming. So I think thank you all very, very much. And thank you from the audience as well. They reckon it's been really interesting and inspiring and gives them heart. Oh, they're coming in. Could have spent hours and hours for this session. Thank you. So
Thank you.
thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Maybe we can have a part 2, Luella.
Yes.
We shall see. Okay, thank you all very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.